Okay, thank you so much for joining us. It's certainly good to be together with you in this forum as we come together again to study from the book of Proverbs and to study the subject of wisdom. I think it's a needed subject in the world in which we live. You know, these are trying days and days in our country where we see so much anger and bitterness. And I can't help but think about a passage over in the book of James. We're going to come back to James in a minute, Lord willing. But in James chapter 3, the Holy Spirit through James addresses people who think that they're qualified to be teachers, but they don't even understand what it means to be a Christian. And James, at the end of that chapter, James 3, asks the question in verse 13, who is a wise man and endued with knowledge among you? Who is the wise man? Well, here's the key. Let him show out of a good conversation, out of a good manner of life, his works with meekness of wisdom. People are shouting and screaming and they want to be heard. They want somebody else not to be heard. But where's wisdom in all of that? Wisdom is seen in the way people behave. In verse 14, if you have bitter envying and strife in your heart, glory not and lie not against the truth. This wisdom descendeth not from above, but is earthly and sensual and devilish. For where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace. So what James reminds us of is that you don't do the work of wisdom with the tools of demons. That's a good lesson. One of the most disappointing things that we see around us is not just how people have turned themselves over to anger and bitterness, but how that is shut down reason. People feel justified in doing almost anything because they believe they're caused to be so righteous. One thing that our study of wisdom reminds us of is that we are always committed as children of God to principle. We're people of principle. That doesn't fluctuate or change depending on our mood. Wisdom requires us to behave in a certain way. And I appreciate the fact that those who would read the book of Proverbs and even those of us who would engage in this study have that as our ambition. We may fail, we may need to repent and ask God to forgive us, and we certainly do ask Him to be merciful to us. But we understand that wisdom calls us to a higher standard. And that's what the book of Proverbs deals with. A lot of it is intensely practical, but that's okay because wisdom, as James taught us, and the passage we just read, is about day-by-day decisions. You know, wisdom and the question of whether I'm wise or you're wise is going to be answered by the things I say and the things that I think and the things that I do today. Not just on the grand stage and not just in the big moments, but in every moment of our life. So we study wisdom. And we're in Proverbs 27. That's where we begin tonight with a very practical passage. Boast not thyself of tomorrow, for thou knowest not what a day may bring forth. What good advice. The word boast there stands out to us. The word boast is halal, and the folks who know Hebrew tell us that the word in its essence means to shine, and then in a secondary sense to draw attention to something or to oneself. And from there, it comes to us as the idea of boasting. And we see here that boasting and something about making plans or expectations for tomorrow go together. What's the connection there? The wise man tells us that there is a danger in being presumptuous about tomorrow and about the future, as if all of that somehow belongs to us. It most certainly does not. And the wise man says, don't be arrogant when it comes to thinking about the future and about where you are and where you're going to be. It reminds us again of James. We could go back to the book of James, this time the 4th chapter. And these are familiar words. In verse 13, James writes, Go to now, ye that say, today or tomorrow we shall go into such a city and continue there a year and buy and sell and get gain. This fellow's got all his plans made. He knows what next year is going to be like, what he's going to do. James said, you don't know what's on the morrow. You're making plans for next year, and you don't know whether you're going to be here 24 hours from now. What is your life? James asked. It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time, and then vanisheth away. The word there, vapor, suggests the idea of like mist or steam coming off boiling water. And you see a little bit of it, and then it's gone. And where does it go? That's the way life seems to be, our life here. It's so brief, and then it just simply disappears. What you ought to say, verse 15, is, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. If the Lord wills. That's not just a saying, but it represents a mindset that we recognize something about ourselves and about our life. Now, he makes an application here. He says, you ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. But now you rejoice in your boastings. Again, he brings it back to the idea of arrogance. People who make all kind of plans without considering God, that's pure arrogance, as if life is ours and we control our life. He said, all such rejoicing is evil. Then in verse 17, he makes this application. Therefore, to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. What's the connection there? The connection is the man, the boastful man, the ungodly man. By that we simply mean somebody who does not consider God and his plans. He may not be a grossly immoral fellow, but he's ungodly in that he is not putting God in his plan. He doesn't think about God's will in every decision that he makes. He may be a highly respectable fellow and hardworking, and he might have a lot of good traits. He's just not at all concerned about God. And that fellow thinks he's got his life mapped out. He doesn't realize that God holds his very breath in his hands. And so, you know what you ought to do. You know what's right. But a man puts that off or puts that from him because he thinks, well, maybe if I ever get around to that, I'll have time later. He said that's sinful. And it's arrogant. And so it is. And that's what this proverb reminds us of. There's an arrogance in procrastination and saying, well, I'll do right later, as if we could guarantee later is coming. One fellow put it this way. He said, the road of by and by leads to the house of never. Many times that's the case. People put off doing right, telling themselves later, and later becomes never. So many passages in the New Testament seem to emphasize, and I hope we're not misusing these verses, but they seem to emphasize this idea of immediacy when it comes to doing right. Today, the Hebrew writer reminds us from the Psalms, today, if you will hear his voice, and harden not your hearts. Paul would write, now is the accepted time. Now is the day of salvation. Today. I think that's talking about more than a date on the calendar. I think he's talking about the time of the coming of the Messiah that had been prophesied of and we've been waiting on, humanity had been waiting on, and now it's come. But there's an urgency there, that this is the time. In contrast to that, you read a passage like Acts 24:25, when Paul is speaking to a Roman governor by the name of Felix. And Felix trembles, and Felix is moved by what Paul says, but not moved enough to make a change. And so he told Paul, he said, well, go for the present, and when I get a chance, this translation says, or when I have a convenient season, I'll call for you, I'll send for you. Of course, we know he never did. He put off thinking that there'll be another time. In Luke chapter 12 and verse 20, the Lord told a very sobering story a picture about a man whose greed, materialism, maybe his good business sense, however people might look at it, had so dominated his life that really God wasn't in his plans. And when he came to the point when he thought, well, now I've acquired enough and now I can begin to enjoy the fruits of my labor, God said, time's up. And now what? God told him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded back from you. That's a great way to put that. I've given it to you as a gift and now I'm taking it back. And what have you got to show for it? Who will get the things that you've accumulated? And what do you have when you leave all of this? What's left of you? Those are questions that deal with our attitude toward the future. I'll tell you another aspect of this. Not only are we called not to delay in doing what's right, to put our time to good use and not to boast about some time later. I think coupled with this is the idea that the Lord reminded us of in Matthew 6:34, that we ought not to even presume troubles in the future and let worries about things that haven't yet come dominate our lives. That's also arrogant in its own way. Don't ever worry about tomorrow, Jesus said. After all, tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Obviously, be an abuse to suggest that Jesus is saying, don't make a plan. But always we recognize the fact that we can ruin today by worrying about things that may never happen. Worry, faithless anxiety is not a part of the life of a Christian. It should not be. You know, somebody that doesn't know God, maybe they have that kind of worry. But as the fellow once put it, Paul wrote about the peace of God that passes all understanding. There's something wrong when someone claims to have peace with God, but doesn't have the peace of God that passes all understanding. The Lord said, don't presume troubles and don't presume tomorrow, but rather live in humility, in subjection to the Lord that loves us so. I love this quotation from the Expositor's Bible Commentary. The verse is not ruling out wise planning for the future, only one's overconfident sense of ability to control the future. And no one can presume on God's future, that is, the future that God owns and provides. Rather, humility is required. One must live from day to day grateful for the life which he has from God, with awareness that it can be withdrawn at any time, and that he must not speak or plan as if he himself had full disposal of his destiny and his power over the future. That's so true. You know, there's so many applications of this principle, but I certainly do think about how in my own life, so many times I might be bothered by frustrations or angered by certain things. And when I boil it down, it comes back to the idea that I had forgotten that my life is not mine and my time is not mine. You think about that yourself. When's the last time you became agitated and frustrated about life because something broke or somehow somebody was late or some circumstance took place that had to change your plan or maybe had to curtail some goal that you got in mind to do? It's not wrong to make goals and to try to work hard from day to day, but at some point I've got to realize that there's just a whole lot of things I don't control. And I've got to come to terms with that. And one thing that I certainly don't control is whether I'm going to be here tomorrow. I make my plan, I do my best, but those things are in the hands of the Lord. And that humility of spirit, I think, is what the wise man calls us to. Don't boast thyself of tomorrow. You don't know what a day may bring. So you've got to be able to roll with the punches, and you've got to be able to recognize at some point bad things happen to people. It may happen to me. Something may happen that'll change my plan. Try to handle life with patience and with faith. And I feel like that's a lesson that I need regularly. Let's look at another, if we may, this time from Proverbs 27, verse 2. Let another man praise thee, and not thine own mouth, a stranger, and not thine own lips. There's a connection, you notice, between these two verses. Verse 1 said, boast not thyself of tomorrow. And verse 2 says, let another man praise thee. Actually, it's the same word. And we said that the word boasting suggests the idea of shining forth, drawing attention. And in the first verse, don't boast yourself of tomorrow. Don't think yourself to be in control of the future, because in the ultimate sense, we're not. And in this passage, he talks about the idea of winning acclaim. But don't let any acclaim that comes your way be from your own mouth. The idea is let others express appreciation if there's appreciation due. But don't, as we sometimes say, blow your own horn. I know that that's greatly out of step with our society. I got to thinking when I was looking at this verse, when's the last time you heard a politician running for office, for example, whose campaign was, well, I've done the best I knew how to do, and with the help of a lot of good people and with the Lord's blessing, we've been able to accomplish some things, not all we wanted to, but that's not how people campaign for office. They make you think that they created the air we breathe. And they've done all these great things, and if you don't vote for me next time, it's just going to be no hope for the planet, because it's all about me. And it must be that that's what people want to hear, because that's what gets elected. Well, that says something about us as a society, and it's not necessarily a good thing. You know, sports are not all that important, and probably they're less important now. That's more obvious with the real problems we've got in the world than it's ever been. But, you know, the lessons that our kids learn from great athletes sometimes is the wrong message. For a while, it's not always been that way. But for a long time, we have had to endure, particularly in professional sports, we've had to endure people, whatever sport you're talking about. They love to get in the mic and talk about they're the greatest thing that's ever been, and there's nobody can handle me. I'm just the greatest. And I notice how that the good folks that volunteer their time to teach the little leagues and the younger kids are having to actively work against that and trying to get the young kids to learn. Look, I don't care what Mr. Big Shot on television does. That's not appropriate. You know, it certainly is a sad thing. We see all the time. Some fella, maybe in football, let's just use that as an example, and he runs in the end zone, you know, and he just can't wait to push everybody out of the way so he can do the look at me two-step, you know, because I scored a touchdown. As if he's so silly he doesn't realize that 8 guys back there had got their brains beat out, blocking some other big guy so he could make his gains. It doesn't happen every time like that. Not every athlete is that way. But for a long time, that's been something that's been admired and something that young people have focused on. And again, sports are sports. That's just entertainment. But the message preached by that entertainment sometimes is not helpful. We think about sports trying to teach good lessons. That's not a particularly good lesson. The look at me when you're dealing with a team sport, the lack of sportsmanship even in individual sports. But it's a part of life. There are a lot of folks who can't wait to brag on themselves. And if I were honest, I'd say that's a challenge for all of us, for me too. I'm not going to brag about my athletic ability, I'm sure of that. But, you know, Mr. Alden in his commentary talked about think about how many times in seemingly innocent ways we find a way to praise ourselves by talking about who we know or what we did or some other thing. What was it the Lord said? He said, don't let your left hand know what your right hand does. In the Sermon on the Mount, when he was talking about some people who ruin even a good deed, like helping someone else. Alms is the old word, giving alms. yet they find a way to use that to brag on themselves. God forbid. And yet it's a problem. So a wise man realizes that if there's any credit to be had, for sure don't give it to yourself. And if any praise comes your way, let it be from some other purpose, from some other source. And if that's what we've been working for, as the Lord said, well, then you've got what you asked for. But it's not really worth a great deal. What we're looking for is the praise of God. And wise people, I think, recognize that fact. One fellow put it this way. I can't remember exactly how he put it, but something along this line. He said, I wouldn't dare make a list of all the great things I've done for God. I know God keeps a list, and I'd be afraid that his list would be a lot shorter than mine. I thought, that's a good point. Paul, in 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 18, in a modern speech paraphrase, his lesson was worded this way: you may brag about yourself, but the only approval that counts is the Lord's approval. And so it is. There's an old Latin saying that I ran across in our study. Self-praise defiles the mouth. Don't you wish that all of us, our young people and all the rest of us, believe that, and that we live that way? Not to look to push ourselves forward as the world would teach, but rather simply to do good, serve God from day to day, and let that be your reward. Whatever else comes from that, then let it also glorify God. That's wise behavior. Well, let's look at another, if we might. Proverbs 27 and verse 3. A stone is heavy and sand weighty, but a fool's wrath is heavier than them both. These are great images that come to us. The idea of heaviness we find in three different words here. One of the words here for heavy is a word that's used a number of times. And it's a very memorable word. Let me start, though, with the word for fool. Let me go back to that word first before I get to the word heavy. We've been talking all along in our study about wisdom and folly. We're in chapter 27, so we've looked at that lesson a lot. And there are several different words for fool that we've seen over and over again, all of them in the book of Proverbs. The word here is the word evil. It's a word we've seen before, but it's a word that it's good to keep in our mind its definition. One lexicographer wrote that this word represents one who despises wisdom, one who mocks when guilty, one who is quarrelsome, one who is licentious. I think there's a great definition, a description of this concept, this word in Jeremiah 4 and in verse 22. God calls his own people foolish and then elaborates and explains more what it means to be evil. They do not know me. They are senseless children. They have no understanding. They are wise to do evil, but to do good they do not know. Now, there's a pretty good description of what we're talking about here. Here's a fool. And the problem is, it's a fool's wrath. And that word wrath also is a memorable word, what we've seen before. It suggests the idea of indignation, vexation, spiteful attitude, an agitation, a heated anger. As I said, this word's used a number of times, and including in the Proverbs. If you'll turn back with me, we'll just look at a couple of references to help us to fully appreciate what we're talking about here. A fool's wrath. Same word is used in Proverbs 12 and in verse 16. And that's where the wise man wrote, a fool's wrath is presently known. I think the English Standard Version says, is known at once. That's an aspect of foolish wrath. Not all anger is condemned in the Scriptures. We know that to be so. But there is a foolish anger. And it's a quick temper. You never read in the Bible about a wise man with a quick temper, do you? They just don't come in that variety. It's like talking about a square circle. There's no such thing as a wise man with a quick temper. A foolish wrath is a wrath that's presently known. Another passage in Proverbs goes back up to verse 21, chapter 21, I should say. And here in verse 19, we have the picture of a wife. It's better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and angry woman. Here's a temper that's not only quickly spurred and open and obvious to all, nothing held back, but it makes those around them miserable, and certainly spreads a lot of unpleasantness. One more reference we'll read of the many that we could is in Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and in verse 9. And here the wise man reminds us to not be hasty in spirit to be angry, for anger resteth in the bosom of fools. Here's our word again for anger. And he talks about a foolish anger, a sinful anger is the kind of anger that the Old King James says rest in the bosom of a fool. The English Standard Version renders that lodges in one. It takes up residence there. I think it was the Revised English Bible that renders this, fools are those who nurse resentments. It's like you take a resentment in and nurse it back to full strength. It's quite a picture here of foolish anger, an anger that's held on to like some sort of a favorite toy, something that we cherish in some wicked, twisted way. Here's a fool's wrath. And let me tell you, when you're thinking about heavy things, that's something heavy. Again, that word heavy, as we mentioned, is used several times in the Scriptures. It's translated heavy in the Old King James in several contexts. Back over in Exodus 17, the reference there is when Israel came out of Egypt and they were attacked by the Amalekites. You remember that God, in order to show his people that it was his power and not their power, had Moses to go to a visible place up on a hill and to hold up his hands. And as he did that, the battle would go Israel's way. But the problem was that his hands became heavy, his arms became heavy. And so as he would let his arms down, then the battle would go the other way. Again, God did that in order to show Israel it was not by their strength. But it was solved. You remember the story was when Aaron and a fellow named Hur came and held up, they had Moses sit down, they held up the arms of Moses that were heavy. You ever tried to hold your arms up for any length of time, you can relate to that. That's the idea, painful, wearying. It's in the next chapter, I think, in the 18th chapter of Exodus, when we find that word used again. And this time it's when Moses, again, he had brought the people out into the wilderness and was trying to keep things organized. And his father-in-law was horrified when he found out that Moses would sit there from morning till evening, from daylight to dark, as we say, judging the people. Can you imagine an entire nation of people coming to one guy? And he's their source of... Jethro said, look, you keep this up, you're going to wear yourself out and all the people out too. It's too heavy for you. You can't handle it. We can certainly relate to that. I'd hate to think about being the one judge over, especially that generation of Israelites. Well, we also find this word used of Solomon. After Solomon's death, people came and they said to Rehoboam, they said, your father was heavy on us. The taxes were burdensome and too much for us. Heavy, we know what that means. One more reference we'll give over in Psalm 38. This is one of the Psalms of David, a penitential psalm, a psalm remembering his sin and looking back with great sorrow. He writes in Psalm 38 in verse 3, there is no soundness in my flesh because of thine anger, neither is there any rest in my bones because of my sin. For mine iniquities are gone over my head. As a heavy burden, they are too heavy for me. The word is used in reference to David's tremendous guilt over the terrible things that he had done. And we may not have been guilty of the sins that David committed, but we certainly can relate to that feeling of guilt. Too heavy. So this is the word the Holy Spirit chooses here in our context. And he talks about, one of the modern speech translations puts it this way, stones and sand are heavy, and by the way they are. But trouble caused by a fool is a much heavier load. One fellow put it, a fool is a thoroughly provocative and burdensome fellow because of his undisciplined and unrestrained outburst. It's less tiresome to heft around a boulder or a bag of sand than to have to put up with him. I like what Brother Harkrider wrote. He said, obnoxious behavior by a fool is more difficult to bear than a load of stone or sand. A heavy weight is much easier to carry than the emotional load of dealing with the irrational, uncontrolled anger of a headstrong fool. And certainly that is the case. When I read that last quotation, I could not help but think about one of the more famous men identified as a fool in the Old Testament. Over in 1 Samuel 25, you'll no doubt remember the story of a man named Nabal. Nabal, by the way, means fool. I think all of us who've read that story have wondered through the years, what was his mom or dad thinking to name the kid fool? Well, we don't blame Nabal for his name. What he can be blamed for is living down to his name. And he did. The story we have here deals with his interaction with David. How that David, when he was actually on the run, persecuted by King Saul, had come in the area where Nabal was, had been very helpful. A fellow like Nabal, a lot of his money is in livestock. He's got sheep out, cattle out of the pastures, and so David had been watching over and helped protect those flocks from marauders and so on. And the time came when the money would come in, when the slaughter would take place, the sale would be there, and David was asking for some recouping of his time, the worth of his time in a time of need. And Nabal treated him like he was just garbage, and spoke harshly to David, thoughtlessly to David, completely unthankful, completely short-sighted. It was just typical of a fool. Now, the story goes on to tell us that Nabal was married to a woman named Abigail. And Abigail was as wise as he was a fool. And when she realized what her husband had done in insulting David, and she was sure of what would happen as a result of that, when you provoke a man in his situation, likely he's going to react badly. So she gathered up a gift, a large gift, and had it sent toward David, and came out and spoke kind words, reconciling words, backed David off the ledge, as it were. But she said to David at one point, in a moment of great candor, painful words, I think, let not my Lord, this is verse 25, by the way, of 1 Samuel 25, let not my Lord, I pray thee, regard this man of Belial, even Nabal. For as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, thy handmaid, saw not the young men of my Lord whom thou didst send. Had to be very painful for Abigail to have to talk that way about the man she was married to. We're not told how all that came about. If this was some sort of arranged marriage, I can't imagine Abigail picking a man like that. But that's where she was. It's just making an application in this regard. We talk about the weight, the load of a fool. It's no fun to be married to a fool. And therefore the Lord would say to us, make a wise choice. Make a wise choice when you pick a husband, you pick a wife, because life can be difficult. It can be quite heavy if you make a bad choice. And Abigail could certainly speak to that point. Of course, the story goes on, and we know how that ends. If you don't, you can go back and read it. But anyway, beware of such relationships, because the relationship with a fool, and it can be quite painful. Okay, I think we can maybe try to get one more in. I think seems to be related to the last verse. He'd been talking about wrath of a fool, but now in verse 4 he writes, "Wrath is cruel, and anger is outrageous, but who can stand before envy?" And so it is. That wrath and anger, they are a powerful force to deal with. It can be quite unpleasant. But he says envy in some ways outdoes them all. You know, the word envy in the Hebrew, and I don't know anything about Hebrew, but those who do tell me that that the word here, kenal, is very much like the Greek word, so often translated envy. Zelos is the word there. Its root meaning is to boil, like you boil water. You see those bubbles coming up. You see the fervency and the activity. And just like in the Greek, so the Hebrew, it can be used two ways. That can be a fervent activity in a good sense or a bad sense. When it comes to that fervency, in a good way, it can be called zeal. And in the right context, it can be the idea of an excitement and an activity for something good. But on the other hand, it can be a fervency in the wrong way, in a way led by bitterness and malice that can be disastrous. In Numbers chapter 5, I think we find that that jealousy can be a natural, and not just a natural, but even an appropriate response. The law of Moses there is talking about a husband toward his wife. And if the spirit of jealousy come upon him, in verse 14, then he was told to take the case to the priest. And there was a procedure there concerning what's called in verse 29 of that chapter, the law of jealousies. There's a lawful way, an orderly way to deal with such feelings. You would expect that a man who is devoted to his wife would be jealous if affections were not handled properly. If a man was disloyal to his wife, she would certainly be understood to be jealous and have a reason to be. But on the other hand, there is a jealousy that's not ruled by law or by reason or by restraint. Over in the Proverbs, in the 6th chapter there, he's talking about the sin of adultery. And, people don't despise a thief if he steals to satisfy his hunger. But he has to pay a price. But if a man steals somebody else's wife, for example, and that type of spirit, the spirit of jealousy, comes into the picture, then it may be that that blood will be shed. That's the point that the Proverbs make. Jealousy is the rage of a man, verse 34. Therefore he will not spare in the day of vengeance. So you have the idea of zeal for God, good thing. You have the idea of a godly jealousy, where something that a person has a right to expect has been withheld or misdirected, and he ought not to be happy about that. God is a jealous God in the sense that he certainly does not appreciate it, nor should he. That the loyalty that belongs to him is given to some other false god. And then we have this kind of uncontrolled, wrathful spirit, a jealousy that becomes a raging fire that has no control. And such behavior can be dangerous and is sinful. Again, a modern speech translation reads, "An angry person is dangerous, but a jealous person is even worse." That's the point that he's making here. Wrath and anger are fraught with evil, hard to be borne, but much worse is still the passion of envy jealousy. Either of these excites deeds most atrocious. You know something about that. When I read that quote from Mr. Stewart, I couldn't help but think about a famous murder case in our country. Probably goes back 30 years. A lot of our young people don't know about it, or have forgotten about it, haven't heard much about it. But it was something that everybody was talking about. Two people were murdered. A wife, an ex-wife, I guess it was, and a man, for whatever reason, that was on her doorstep with her, were confronted by a knife-wielding perpetrator who killed them both in cold blood, and in a fit of rage. What made the case so famous was that the accused was one of the most popular and well-known people in the country at that time, a guy named O.J. Simpson, former athlete, had been a very popular television personality. As far as I know, had never been involved in criminal activity before. I don't really know his whole history. Man, never got a parking ticket. But suddenly, it seemed obvious to everybody but a California jury that he had hacked up two people with a knife. You know, how does a guy go from one place to another? How does he go that far out? Jealousy, rage, worse than mere anger, worse than wrath, a jealous wrath. And I don't know, again, this is not a political statement, but just by the way, injustice is not something new. And I don't remember at that time, I can remember people being amazed and disappointed that the system seemed to fail so badly as far as convicting a man who seemed to be obviously guilty. But there wasn't this spirit all over the country of junking the system and throwing the country away or flushing it down the drain because some injustice had been done. You know, these things have happened. They are terrible. There are ways to deal with them and there are ways not to. But be that as it may, our point is simply about the power of jealousy and how jealousy and rage that comes from jealousy can create, well, he used the word atrocities. Outbursts of temper may subside. Jealousy unchecked will continue to brood and eat like a cancer until it finds some device by which to conquer its victim. We could go back and look at the case of Cain, for example. He's a great example of that idea of jealousy. He killed his brother. And why? John says because his brother's deeds were righteous and his own were evil. What did God warn him about over there in Genesis chapter 4? This is the English Standard Version. After Cain had been rejected and his brother's worship had been accepted, he became angry with Cain about that, angry with Abel about that, brother. And God asked him, why are you angry? Why are you stewing in this anger? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin crouching at the door, its desire is for you, you must rule over it. Of course, he didn't rule over it. He allowed it to rule him and the disastrous consequences that came. But that was out of jealousy. I think about the story of Joseph's brothers. And why did they eye him? And why did they treat him with such contempt and bitter hatred, sell him into slavery, contemplated murdering him? Well, because their father loved Joseph, but didn't love them the same way. It was just jealousy. And then we have the story of King Saul. And why was it that Saul was so angry with his most loyal servant and an able servant, David? Because the women shouted, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000. Nothing new about jealousy. And what it did to all of these individuals ought to stand there as a reminder. Don't let it take root in your heart. Don't let that kind of uncontrolled, raging jealousy have a hold of you, because it'll take you where you never dreamed you'd go. Proverbs 14 and verse 30, a tranquil mind brings life to one's body, but jealousy causes one's bones to rot. And there have been plenty of examples of that through the years. Okay, we'll pause there. Thanks so much for being a part of this effort. We're glad that you're with us, and we hope that you'll join us again, Lord willing,